Hello, everyone. Before we get into today's really interesting interview with Philip Goldberg, who's the author of American Veda, I just wanted to remind you, if you haven't done so already, to make sure you've subscribed to our growing community of seekers by texting the word embody, E-M-B-O-D-Y, to the number 44222. So each week we send out our newest and most popular content from our audio, video, and written offerings, and we also offer opportunities to our subscribers that we don't publish at all on the website. It doesn't cost anything. You just have to text the word embody, E-M-B-O-D-Y, to the number 44222. There's a lot of exciting things coming up for embodied philosophy, including a video recording of the recent abuse of power in the yoga community panel that took place in New York City in May. And we also have some upcoming workshops, online workshops, trainings, and courses. So I just want to make sure you don't miss out on any of that. So again, you can text embody to 44222. All right, let's get to the interview with Philip Goldberg. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Philip Goldberg. Philip Goldberg is the author and co-author of numerous books, most popularly American Veda. He's a public speaker and workshop leader, a meditation teacher, and ordained interfaith minister. He lives in Los Angeles and blogs regularly on Huffington Post and Spirituality and Health. He's also the co-host of the podcast Spirit Matters, which I myself have listened to on several occasions, and it is a great resource for the audience, our own audience, as it investigates the philosophy and the spirituality of the wider yoga and wisdom traditions. So with that, thank you so much, Philip, for joining us.
Very good to be with you.
So, Philip, I'm very excited for this interview because I myself have read and really read with a lot of passion your book, American Veda. It introduced to me a lot of the history of how Indian thought has come to the West, a lot of which was very new for me. So I would love for you just first, before we get into the topic of that book and the material that you covered in that particular work, I would love to hear a little bit about your life and what has sort of led you to this deep investigation of this tradition.
Well, I was a child of the 60s, and all that entails.
Right.
And when I was a college student and was trying to do my best to end the Vietnam War and promote civil rights and doing all those politically active things, I was essentially internally also searching for answers to the bigger questions of life. Who am I? What am I doing here? How do you get happy? Mm-hmm. How do you become fulfilled? How do we relate to the rest of the world and the cosmos? And I wasn't getting very satisfactory answers from any of the sort of mainstream or grown-up sources, which made me very much like, many other people of my generation who turned to the counterculture mm-hmm. For those answers. And somehow, in the mix of books and people and drugs and drug experiences and all the rest, the teachings from the East gained more and more prominence in our conversations and in our reading material and so forth. Of course, this is long before there was an internet or mm-hmm. any other easy sources of information. And something just really resonated in me with the teachings that we call Hinduism and Buddhism, also Taoism, and just the Asian spiritual teachings resonated with me deeply. I had no religious background. I was raised by secular atheist type of people, and I thought religion was the opium of the masses, like as Marx put it, but then these teachings came along, and I said, well, there must be a different angle on what we think of as religion, because this doesn't seem superstitious or belief-oriented, and nobody's asking me to pledge allegiance to anything. These just seem like very pragmatic, practical teachings. philosophically and practically, they made a lot of sense to me. They were called mystical, but they seemed more rational than either Western religion or even psychology, which I was majoring in, which, Freud seemed mystical and mysterious compared to these teachings. So I just, they resonated with me and my own inner experience and my own hunches, and people I respected, grown-ups, people like Aldous Huxley and others, and Alan Watts were promoting them, and I just voraciously wanted to know more and more and more and more. And that eventually led, because I'm a practical guy, and I saw that in these teachings, they were all pointing to not to belief, but to inner experience and transformative inner spiritual practices, predominantly meditation. And so I took up transcendental meditation not long after the Beatles did, and famously, and then I took to that very well and got deeper and deeper into it, and eventually became a teacher of it and spent much of the 70s doing that. And the rest, is just an expansion of that until, I became a professional writer and I was working on books and all that. And at one point I said, boy, the importation of these teachings from the East into American life is spreading so broadly across the landscape. It's not just me and my ex-hippie friends. It's psychology and medical care and boardrooms and all kinds of interesting places. And eventually, and then of course the yoga boom happened, and the time was right to chronicle it as a matter of history. And I think a very significant and important piece of American history is this meeting of East and West in the spiritual landscape and how it's affected the culture. So that all came together. And the editor at Random House agreed with me, and I wrote the book. So there it is. And that's the short version.
And an excellent book it is, for sure.
Thank you.
Yes, and before we get into the conversation about how, as you're touching upon, how this meeting of East and West really shifted the dynamic in this country, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. But before we get there, I'm interested. You bring up the point of being a child of the '60s, and of course, many of the foremost teachers today, teaching yoga philosophy or teaching on Indian traditions, were captivated and mobilized by this countercultural movement in the '60s. But now it seems that there's the spirit of the seeker has changed a bit, in the sense that it seems like one can be a student of this kind of thought without necessarily being countercultural or
sure.
And so I guess I would love to hear what you've observed about kind of the spirit of the seeker in relation to what you experienced in the '60s versus what we're kind of looking at today.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, we think of the '60s and when we talk about the '60s, we're really pretty much talking about the mid to late '60s into the '70s.
Right.
Because the early '60s was Mad Men.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And then it started to shift in the mid '60s and peaked in '68 and then went through into the mid '70s. So, and we think of that as, the Woodstock generation and hippies and counterculture and nonconformity. But there was a lot of other things going on and a whole lot of people who were not part of that. Mm-hmm. And many of them were drawn to it, too. I remember sometime around 1970 getting really deeply into meditation and hanging out with people. And it shocked me when I would see somebody, looking very straight and voting Republican because, and I started to realize even then, these teachings appeal to a lot of people. And the lifestyle stuff is only, a superficial thing. And when you look at the history, as I did, the '60s were the anomaly. The people can be very unconventional in their, mental and spiritual outlook, and on the surface appear very conventional and normal. And a lot of those kind of people, who on the surface were just ordinary Americans, that's who was also drawn to these teachings. And, just the explosion of the 60s and 70s gave it this countercultural air. So one can be sort of countercultural on the inside and unconventional and seek in unusual ways. And it might have nothing to do with who they hang out with or the clothing they wear or the occupations they pursue. But the larger issue you're raising is very true. The explosion of interest in Indian spirituality and yoga that really took off in the 70s and late 60s and 70s. And as we'll see when we get back to American Veda, goes back, to 200 years, slowly building up. But the explosion of it back then led to a mainstreaming of these ideas and teachings. So by the mid to late 70s, it wasn't just, the youth counterculture that was taking to meditation and yoga. It was their parents. And it started to seep into the medical community. And that started back in the 70s. And now, your doctor will tell you to meditate and do yoga for stress reduction. And, you see it on television, and, all Oprah's audience and Dr. Oz's audience, they're being told, these practices are good for them. And so part of what happened in the 60s was to thrust this into the spotlight, and that caught the attention of people in the mainstream, and then the teachings got adapted to all kinds of places. I mean, look at the yoga world now. You have counterculture type of spiritual seekers, in the same yoga room or the same yoga festival as you might a stockbroker who's on vacation.
Right.
And so that just speaks to me of the mainstreaming of these teachings.
Yes. So one thing that came up while you were speaking, and I'm thinking about the popularity of yoga. I mean, there's definitely, obviously, in certain communities, a retaining of the philosophy of the tradition. But it seems like oftentimes the practices themselves are not necessarily being couched in the service of a kind of enlightenment or a certain kind of liberation that is often spoken about in the text, but is rather sort of a new, a more holistic approach to stress relief.
Yeah.
So, do you think it's
yes,
yes, and it is. But do you think it's problematic that there is kind of an anesthetizing of the tradition in this way, and we're losing we're trying to kind of sidestep around the stuff that's a little harder, which is kind of the real spiritual work?
Well, you're bringing up a really interesting and important question, and it's and there's a lot of passion around it, and a lot of argument about it, which I think is tremendously healthy. Yeah. And as somebody who has looked at this extensively, as a historical development. And is in touch with people on all ends of the spectrum because of my research. I have a more nuanced view of it, and I think it's necessary to have a nuanced view because, on the one hand, yes, it's problematic, and it's a deep concern to many of us, including me, that the word yoga is coming to and has come to mean or be synonymous with physical exercises.
Right.
So people say when people think of yoga, or many people, they think of yoga, they think of yoga asanas, the postures and exercises of mainly stretching and bending, some of which are very traditional. and some of which are sort of modern inventions. And that's a kind of reduction of the fullness of yoga. That is not just philosophical, as you suggest. It is also a matter of the transformation of consciousness, which is always been what yoga is really about. The word, as you know, means union, essentially. And as I like to say, it doesn't just mean the union of the head to the knee. It means the union of the individual self, consciousness, individual personality with the cosmic consciousness, the universal self, known in the East as Brahman, what some people might call God, what some people might just call, the universal intelligence or energy, depending on your perspective. But the union of the individual consciousness with something bigger and what we think of as spiritual. And that's always been the essence of what yoga points to and aims at. And the physical exercises called asanas were done mainly in the traditional context as a sort of prelude to deep meditation. They aid the system in settling into deep meditation. So the traditional set of practices, the traditional sadhana, might include asanas and pranayama, breathing exercises, and then deep meditation. And that's been diluted in this emphasis on yoga as a fitness practice, and that's good for your health and your physical appearance and your well-being, and it is all that, and it's tremendously valuable. And so, but the downside is it becomes seen as only that.
Yes,
and that's problematic. On the other hand, there's always an on the other hand, because they're very complicated. Many people come to yoga because of those reasons. They want better health. They want to feel better. They want to look better. They want to, cure their back pain or their arthritis or whatever it is. And that is a legitimate entry point if that's their concern. And all the great yoga teachers, all the great gurus and swamis who have come here, they knew, and they taught their devotees to speak to people on the level of their own interests and concerns. So if somebody, even back in the day when meditation was in the forefront, back in, late 60s and 70s when I got into this stuff, asanas, was a small part of it. It was mostly about meditation. But then, as soon as studies were done on the effects of meditation, people flocked to it because they found that it would help lower their blood pressure or diminish their anxiety or help them get over depression without debilitating drugs. So the entry point could be on that level of health and well-being. And then what often happens, while for many people, that's it, that's enough, and that's content with that, and they don't go any further. But for some people, they might come to a yoga class for that kind of physical benefit and discover there's something more to it, either because of something the teacher says or some inner experience. And they say, whoa, I didn't expect this inner feeling of peace or tranquility. I didn't expect my consciousness to feel different. What's going on here? Maybe I'll buy a book. Maybe I'll go to the advanced class. So if we don't want to denigrate that motivation, because it's often the doorway into yoga in the deeper and bigger sense of the word. And that's, something everybody should keep in mind. Some of the most experienced yoga teachers and the most deeply spiritual yoga teachers first turned to yoga because they had back pain or, something like that. So we should not denigrate that motivation too much. But there is, at the same time, the problem of making sure people know there's more to it.
Yeah, I think that's really important what you said, and I've actually said in another podcast when we were talking about a similar issue that I myself actually came to yoga through a gym, very physical setting, and now I'm creating a web platform for yoga philosophy. So and for a long time I couldn't really even stomach hearing anything that even remotely broached upon God, which sometimes, in some classes I would hear, because I had been so shaped by a certain Judeo-Christian upbringing that I had rejected when I had started my yoga practice. So it took a long time for those teachings to kind of start to settle in, and for me to actually have an ear for them. So it does. You're absolutely right. It does happen in that way for so many people, especially given that America is such a physical culture, physical fitness culture. So
yeah, and if I may add, people are under a lot of stress.
Yeah,
and they want relief from that stress. They want relief from the anxiety and the depression or whatever it is, and that's their immediate concern. Or they have a physical ailment of some kind, often stress related, and now people will hear that yoga is good for those things, and that's their initial entry point. But things happen, many, they may then realize there's more to it and become interested in the rest of the package of what yoga really is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a great segue into now a discussion of American Veda, your book. And because we're talking about entry point, it's interesting that, this wasn't always the entry point. And when these teachings actually entered America, it was in a very different form. It was mainly a philosophical form. And so, and one thing that is really interesting and was new to me in your book, or at least the teaching of yoga, or teaching of the entrance of these teachings into the American landscape, I'd never seen starting in this place, was your mentioning of Thoreau and Emerson specifically, and I believe another figure which you can share. And I thought that was very interesting because usually in historical mentions of when yoga arrived, if it's not the physical teachers like Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois and Krishnamacharya, it's Vivekananda. But actually, in your book, you discuss the entrance as being a bit earlier. So I would love for you to just kind of start that story for us.
Yeah. The teachings really started to come into America, into New England for the most part, by way of books. It was in the early 19th century and late in the previous century. But in the early 1800s, traders and people going to India and other parts of the Orient would get interested and maybe bring back books. But what started to happen in the early 19th century was some of the better translations and commentaries about what was then called, what we think of as Hinduism and Buddhism, were coming to us through Europe by some German writers and translators and philosophers, but mostly the Brits, who were governing India at that time, occupying India. And the irony is that a lot of the scholars were writing about Indian philosophy and Hindu tradition in a way that was meant to serve the missionary efforts and the colonial efforts, but some of those scholars began to see that there's great wisdom and value in some of these teachings, and the translations and commentaries became more honest and more accurate. And they started to filter in they affected the English poets and romantic philosophers and idealists, and then those books came to America, and the early adopters were the sort of intellectual elite of Boston and that area. One of whom was Ralph Waldo Emerson's father, who was a minister, and so he and other contemporaries had study circles, and they published journals, and they were in communication with some of the intellectual elite of India, and that's how it grew. So Emerson, the Emerson we know, grew up with those books and people talking about this stuff, and by the time he was in Harvard, as a student, he was pretty deeply immersed in it. He had there were a lot of other influences going on, but so Emerson's philosophy, which is we think of as really the first homegrown American philosopher, and his influence is incalculable on American literature and American thinking and philosophy. And he was deeply influenced by Hindu and Buddhist thought. And you could see it in his work, and I chronicle it in American Veda. And he, in turn, influenced Henry David Thoreau. So when Thoreau famously was at Walden Pond for that long sojourn that he wrote about in Walden, which most high school and college students read at one point, he was reading the Bhagavad Gita every morning. And he had borrowed that book from Emerson, and he was reading it. So in Walden and his other writings, he's just singing the praises of the Vedic teachings, and especially the Bhagavad Gita. And interestingly, in Walden, he calls himself a yogi. Now, as I like to point out in my talks, there were no yoga studios. In Walden Pond, near Walden Pond or Concord, Massachusetts at that time. Although, now there's probably 100 of them in Concord, and
right.
Cambridge is 13 miles away, and so that whole area is probably inundated with meditation classes and yoga studios. But then it was just books, and people like Emerson and Thoreau, and later Walt Whitman, and the other transcendentalists, they were deeply immersed in it, and it wasn't their only influence. They were also influenced by certain Western philosophers and their own incredible insights. But it informed their philosophy and their writing in a very deep and profound way. So it goes back that far. So people reading Emerson and Thoreau to this day in college or high school, they're getting a taste of Indian philosophy, whether they realize it or not.
So what would you say was sort of the essence of what they found in those texts that they could not find within kind of the literature of the West at that time? Like, what was so inspiring
or
to
the
them?
Religion of the West?
Right.
Because Emerson was a minister. Emerson went to Harvard Divinity School and, became a minister, and then gave it up. As he put it, he defrocked himself. He just walked away from the conventional ministry and gave a very famous address to the graduates of Harvard Divinity School, where he essentially said, your people don't need you to preach to them. They need you to give them a direct experience of divinity and of the divinity within themselves. And that notion of that we are divine beings, that the core of our identity is not that we're depraved, sinners, but that we are divine beings. We are spiritual beings, and that our essence is the same as the essence of the cosmos, or the universe, or God, as Emerson might have put it. And that is, core teaching from the Vedas, thousands of years ago. It's the core essence of yoga, the essence of Vedanta philosophy, also the essence of Buddhism, if you look at it from the right angle. And they had, I think, Emerson and Thoreau, people like that, had that direct experience of that when they were in the woods, and they were writing about it. And some of the scholars believe that the teachings of India helped them understand it. And that essential turn from religion or spirituality as something that is about belief and tradition and the person of Jesus, because there was, all Christians at that time, to an approach to spirituality that recognized that our own divine essence, and that the whole purpose of religion was to turn you within so you could experience and unfold that in your life and realize your own divinity, your own divine nature, and the practical consequences of that in terms of happiness and fulfillment of a human life. That's what the essence of Indian spirituality is. And people like Emerson would have seen that had been lost in the Judeo-Christian world, and it was time to revive it.
So interesting. So now moving forward to Vivekananda, which isn't too much later in history, Vivekananda, as we mentioned, is often considered, by some historical accounts, like the beginning of yoga in America. But you go to some lengths in the book to express that what Vivekananda offered us was not necessarily representative of India as a whole, but rather it was representative of a very particular stream. And so I would love for you to just kind of explore that with us.
Yeah.
Let us know what that is.
Let's put him in a context. I call Vivekananda the Jackie Robinson of American Veda because he was the first Swami, the first guru to come here and have an impact. At the time, 1893, when most Americans had never even met a Jew, and many had never met a Catholic, let alone a Hindu. And, a dark-skinned Hindu in orange robes. This was pretty bizarre, yes. So he came in 1893 with the express purpose of appearing at the World's Parliament of Religion in Chicago. It was part of a big World's Fair. And representatives of the world's religions were invited. But it was, predominantly, overwhelmingly a Protestant thing, because we were a Protestant country. And to everybody's shock and surprise, Vivekananda stole the show. He, certainly people whose agenda was to prove that Christianity was this, the supreme religious tradition, were not prepared for that. Just as white supremacists were not prepared for Jackie Robinson to, prove that black people could play baseball better than average guy. So Vivekananda showed up, and he was so magnetic, and his eloquence was so profound, and his demeanor of ecumenical love for all the religions and respect was great. And what he was expressing was the essence of Vedanta philosophy, and that appealed to a great many people. So he became the star of the show, and they had to schedule extra lectures for him, and he got a lot of newspaper coverage. He also got attacked, predictably, by especially by conservative Christians who just thought he was a heathen who should be sent back to India for preaching false religion. and so there's always been that kind of dichotomy in American life. But to get to your point, India at the time, under severe occupation by the British Empire, and previous to that, occupation and domination by the Muslim invaders from the Middle East or adjacent countries in Asia. There was a spirit alive in India at the end of the 19th century of wanting to, it was the beginning of the freedom movement, the independence movement, but it was also a spiritual revival of wanting to bring Hinduism into the modern era. And a lot of the traditional teachings, a lot of what we think of as yoga philosophy and the teachings of the Upanishads and this great philosophy that attracted people like Emerson, had been lost. And everyday Hinduism had become just sort of routine and ritualized and superstitious. So there was a push by well-educated Indians to reform Hinduism. And Vivekananda was part of that. Mm-hmm. And so he was also very conscious. After his speeches at the Parliament, he had become so well known that he decided to stay, and they booked him on a lecture tour, and he ended up staying and establishing the first teaching organizations for the propagation of Hindu-like ideas or Indian philosophical ideas. They were called Vedanta societies, and they still exist in most cities. And for a long time, that was the only game in town for people interested in these ideas. But in so doing, he was smart enough he didn't import everyday Hinduism with all the symbols that the people are now familiar with. You know, now we see the statues and images of Ganesha and Kali and Lakshmi and all these forms of Indian deities, and many of us, understand them in a certain way and find them appealing and attractive. But it would have looked like just crazy idol worship to Americans back in the 19th century, and he knew that. And so what he emphasized was the philosophy of Vedanta, which is essentially, if I could get a little esoteric.
Go for it.
Vedanta means the end of the Vedas, Veda Anta, the end of the Veda, and it usually means either a period, a chronological period, where sort of what scholars think of as the end of the Vedic era, but it also means a sort of culmination of the Vedic teachings, which had evolved from ancient days and were sort of encapsulated into the teachings in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. And that philosophy of Vedanta is what Vivekananda emphasized. It's the sort of core universal teachings, what you might think of as a science of consciousness, because they don't have to be seen. They were seen as religious teachings, but that's the way we frame them. And, people could just as easily, and many people do, East and West, see them as a science, deep insights into the nature of human life and consciousness and our relation to the cosmos that can be tested like scientific hypotheses in direct experience. And the direct experience comes in the teachings of yoga. So what he was teaching was the philosophy of Vedanta and the pathways of yoga. He was the first to, many of your listeners will be familiar with Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Gyan Yoga, Raja Yoga. He wrote books or gave talks that turned into books on each of those four pathways of yoga. And he was the first to do that in English for the rest of us to learn from. So it was a combination of Vedanta and yoga philosophy and the methodologies of yoga that he emphasized, not the rituals, not the ceremonial life, not what you see. If you go to India and you go to a temple, you won't necessarily, you might sometime hear somebody giving a discourse on Vedanta philosophy or something, but it's mostly people chanting and people doing offerings to deities and that sort of thing. He knew that would be looked upon as some weird, crazy religion, and that was just not part of what he introduced. He introduced philosophical ideas that could hold up to rational thinking and inquiry, and methods that later gurus, emphasized even more than he did, of inner transformation. And that's, appealed very much to spiritual seekers and just pragmatic Americans who just found something of value to be explored. That makes sense?
Yes, totally. I mean, it's so fascinating. He was in essence a pragmatist, and really was so aware, as you're saying, of what could and could not be kind of digested by American culture, and thank goodness he did, because he really did make such an impact.
Right, so, and that's in a sense, you could historically. You could say that kind of set the template, because the gurus who came in the 20th century, the ones who became very famous, like Yogananda, who's I'm now working on a biography of Yogananda.
Oh, excellent.
Probably the most famous of all the gurus because of the autobiography of a yogi.
Yeah.
So I'm writing his biography now, and it's incredible, how he was very much in the same mold. He actually grew up a short walk from where Vivekananda grew up in Calcutta, and a generation later. And you see the pragmatism in his early work, and the work he kept up for 32 years in America. Practical techniques, practical philosophy to apply to everyday life, and teachings that could be adapted to any way of life, whether you're in a village in India or, New York or L.A., living a householder life and running a business or whatever. And all the subsequent gurus, the ones of the 60s, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and Muktananda and Satchidananda, they all followed that same template of adapting teachings in a way that would be appropriate to the Western audience.
So let me ask you a question actually about Yogananda. I hadn't really intended to talk about this, but now that you've been studying this, I bet you have some insightful things to say. So in Autobiography of a Yogi, as many people know who've read it, there's a lot of magic, and there's a lot of things that to us kind of materialist Westerners, it's hard to imagine that they could be true. So I guess my curiosity is, was he intending something to be read metaphorically? Is there kind of a subtle, is there kind of a subtle boundary between like what is magical and what is real, that you have to be in a certain kind of spiritual place to grasp? I mean, what was his intention there? Was he meaning to offer facts, or was he meaning to offer something that kind of like was in this strange place between magical realism and realism?
Well, it's fascinating you should bring this up today, because just yesterday I had a long conversation about this with one of the monastics at the Self-Realization Fellowship who, represents Yogananda's teaching. And so it's a nuanced answer. One, no, I don't think he meant them metaphorically. He was describing experiences he had and that were reported to him that occurred to other yogis. Why did he include so many? I think partly because to him, these, what we think of as miraculous occurrences, superpowers of yogis and so forth, they're dramatic. People have argued for millennia whether Jesus actually performed miracles. And if he were capable of those miracles, why did he do them? And because he famously said, "Oh, you generation, you need to see signs and miracles." And, Yogananda quoted that at the beginning of the Autobiography of a Yogi. He quotes that passage from the New Testament. And I think he was saying, hey, you're not going to pay attention unless I I give you something really interesting and dramatic.
Yeah.
If it was just philosophy, but the point, I think, to a lot of that, and there are two kinds of people who love the autobiography of a yogi: people who love it because of all that stuff, and people who love it despite all that stuff. Right? They don't believe it. They don't care about it. It's a distraction. But they go right for the rest of the book, which is wonderful stories about his own experiences, his own life, but a lot of important philosophical ideas about yoga and Indian philosophy and deep insights into the nature of life. Mm-hmm. That's why people love the book. And the miracles and the fascinating yogic powers and so forth, they can either be a distraction or demonstrations that some of the core ideas of yoga about the power of consciousness and the supremacy of the mind with respect to the body are actually true. Because look, really advanced yogis can do this. And even you can do these practices and improve the power of your mind and the power of your mind to influence your body for the better and to manifest in your life the things you want to achieve and so forth. If people can, fly and materialize things and all this other stuff, there are, even for you ordinary yogis, there's something there.
Yeah.
So, and you can directly contact this higher power, this higher intelligence, the power of the cosmos, the power of God or God consciousness, and absorb that and energize your own life and your own mind and so forth. So there were dramatic ways of making that point. Yeah. And I would think that would have been his rationale for including it.
Right. It's almost like they're an invitation to expand our understanding of what is real and what is possible.
That's right.
In order to move, to become more expansive in this practice, you really have to entertain the possibility that what your conception of reality delimits might be very narrow.
Quite good. Quite right. Quite right. So, he would, even in some of his lectures, he wouldn't just lecture. He would do certain little demonstrations of mental powers, and that gets people's attention.
Yeah, sure does. All right. Well, let's move into, we've been throwing around this word, Hinduism a lot, and many of the listeners will be familiar with it, and maybe it's not problematic to them. But I wanted to maybe let you kind of explore what that word is. It's actually, a more contemporary word, as we know, or more modern. So I'm wondering if you can kind of explore what Hinduism is and how it's often misunderstood.
Well, it's a problem in this world of, yoga and practical applications of Vedanta and Indian philosophy. Where does Hinduism begin and end? And is yoga Hindu and all this? And it's so complicated, and people come down on different sides of it depending on their own point of view and, their own backgrounds. But, in India, there's people who don't even like the term Hindu. They are what we would call Hindus. They're born to it. But, they don't like it because it's essentially an invention of colonial powers.
Yeah.
The word Hindu derives from the Persians who came from what's now Iran into India, and they called the people who lived on the other side of the Indus River Hindus. It was a kind of, the H sound came into it at some point, but that's who they were. And the Brits, for thousands of years, the Indian spiritual tradition was known as Sanatana Dharma, meaning the eternal way, the eternal tradition, the eternal teachings. And it's incredibly diverse. Somebody once called Hinduism the world's most disorganized religion. If you go to India, depending on what village you're in and, what part of India you're from, it's, different expressions and manifestations of Hinduism. And it makes, the diversity within, the Christian tradition look uniform by comparison. It's so diverse. And so all these teachings that stem essentially from the Vedas thousands of years ago, as time evolved and, different parts of the country, different climates, different cultural traditions, it took on different forms. And the Brits wanting something, because, the West, we have to categorize everything. And, so they saw what looked like to them as religious practices, and they wanted to classify it, and they called it Hinduism. For the Hindus, it's the religion practiced by the people called Hindus, so it got all lumped together, and all these Indic, traditions from India became known as Hinduism, and the people who followed the teachings that stem from the Buddhist reform. The time of the Buddha, they're Buddhists. And so it has a modern sort of overlay of how the West categorizes religion. And a lot of people find it very misleading to think of Hinduism as one of the world religions, and to use kind of religious categories and the way we understand religion in the West, and to impose that on traditions in Asia, like that we call Hinduism and Buddhism, is often inaccurate. It's, a round peg in a square hole kind of thing. Yeah. So it leads to a lot of misunderstanding about what Hinduism is and what it's not, and it overlooks the tremendous diversity within it. All that said, if there is something called Hinduism, and many Indian Hindus embrace the term, they say, hey, this is what it's called, so we'll embrace it, and we'll educate people about what it is. The way it's practiced in India, in all its diversity, is and the way it is often practiced now with Hindu Americans, because now we have, since the 60s, a gradual increase in the Hindu population, meaning Hindus of Indian descent living in America, and now first and second generation American born, and they've opened up temples, just as Jews built synagogues in the 100 years ago, and Catholics built Catholic churches. So there's now Hindu temples here, where what is practiced is very similar to what is practiced in ordinary life in India. But the yoga world and the world of meditation and the gurus who came, they're, you could say, a derivation of the Hindu tradition, adapted to American life, if you like. But the essence of these teachings is you don't have to see them in religious terms. You could see them in psychological terms. You could see them as philosophical systems. You could be a total secularist atheist and benefit from the practices of yoga and get insight from the philosophy we think of as Hinduism, but could be understood as a philosophical system.
Yeah.
So it gets a little complicated because we think of religion in a certain box, and things like yoga and philosophy in different boxes. But
yeah, it's so interesting, and I'm so glad you brought that up, of this concept, this category of religion and how it distorts, the things that we kind of projected upon. And immediately when you said that, it sort of came to my mind. Buddhism. I mean, when I growing up, I had a class. I went to Christian school. My parents put me through Christian school, and we had a class of other religions, and Buddhism. We studied it in this very narrow way, and the Buddha was purported to be a god. But of course, if you know anything about Buddhism, it's not a theistic tradition.
Exactly. Right,
So it's
right.
just, it's so interesting how, by projecting that category upon different traditions, we distort them in terms of this, vision of things that is very specific to our own historical context.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so we think of religion as faith traditions. We call them faith traditions. Well, faith isn't that important in Hinduism or Buddhism. It's direct experience. There's always a certain amount of faith, but faith is not what's emphasized.
Yeah.
What's emphasized is one's own inner personal, relationship to the divine. Mm-hmm. And that's the essence of yoga. And that we have these ways of explaining it. And it leads to crazy situations like Hindus wanting to, proudly have it recognized that yoga, in all of its, popularity and practical benefits, is part of their tradition. Mm-hmm. And then you have fundamentalist Christians who think yoga is the work of the devil, and it's a sneaky way of imposing Hinduism on you, and they prove it by quoting Hindus who say, yes, yoga is part of our tradition. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't be further apart in real life, but, so, there it is. It gets very confusing.
Yeah, it certainly does.
But as I'm very fond of saying, one of the great glories of yoga, in the larger sense of the word, capital Y yoga, is it can mean many things to many people. Mm-hmm. And so it could be a secular thing, it could be a medical thing, it could be a psychological thing, it could be a physical exercise, it could be a deep spiritual thing, or a religious thing, and it's all true. Yeah. And the downside of something being that universal and that versatile is, people get confused by how to label it, if you need to label it something.
Yeah. Mm. So I have a question now that is it's going to be probably one of our final questions, and it's I want to explore something a bit more maybe political, which I was listening to your Spirit Matters podcast, which is, as we mentioned at the beginning, is a wonderful resource, wonderful podcast. You interview some incredible speakers, and in one of your interviews, you discuss with your interviewee the topic of how these practices and this tradition and these teachings are sitting comfortably or uncomfortably, as it is in some contexts, in India itself. And I feel like we have this, a lot of us who have not been to India or don't know much about India have this kind of imaginary or fantasy that, the most comfortable home for these teachings is in India, and these teachings are beloved, and there's an incredible amount of support for the propagation of these teachings. And I learned from this podcast that this is actually not true, and the relationship to these teachings within India is actually very diverse and in some ways controversial. So I would love for you to kind of explore that, because I think it's going to be news to a lot of people.
I'm glad you gave us plenty of time for this, because you're asking great questions that beg for long, nuanced answers. India is a really complicated place. Mm-hmm. It's, the world's biggest democracy. It's very diverse, very complicated, very chaotic, in the midst of tremendous change as it modernizes, and still, only 60, 70 years after gaining independence, after hundreds of years of colonialism. So there's a lot going on there. Mm-hmm. And, spiritual teachings have a way of getting lost and revived over the centuries, just as I don't think many people would think that modern Christianity is exactly what Christ taught.
Right.
And, far from it. So, things get distorted, things get diminished, things get changed, or things fail to adapt to cultural changes as the world evolves. And so Hinduism is, in many ways, in India, these practical aspect of the Vedantic and yogic pathways kind of got lost in the shuffle of all the challenges India has had and the occupation by Christian and Muslim forces. And actually, when you think of it, it's pretty amazing that it stayed alive as well as it did, to the point where even 200 years ago, in the middle of the British Empire, it could have these teachings could find their way halfway around the world to America and influence people like Emerson and Thoreau, and then all of the rest of us over the course of 200 years. So they stayed alive in certain circles, intellectual and spiritual circles, in the monasteries, in the ashrams, in the guru-centered world, but in a different way in everyday life. And the teachings of Hatha Yoga, the physical practices, were at a certain point, 100 years ago, denigrated. And the mystical teachings that we are now so enamored of and finding such great value in, many of them, after independence, were denigrated by secularists who just wanted to modernize the country, many of whom had a sort of Marxist orientation to life, of materialist outlook, wanting to improve conditions for the masses and improve the economy. And in their eyes, religion and these superstitious teachings were old-fashioned, antiquated, and of no value. They were holding people back. They were being complacent because they fed complacency rather than energized activism to modernize the country and change the economy and so forth. So it wasn't just that teachings were ignored. In many cases, by certain intellectual elites and so forth, they were denigrated. So with all that, they still stayed alive in many circles. And then an interesting thing happened. And a lot of the gurus who came here foresaw that this would happen. When these teachings, especially the pragmatic methods of meditation and yoga, were sort of validated by Western science, that's something we haven't talked about yet, but one of the things that happened as a result of the counterculture boom in the 60s and 70s was people got very curious about meditation and yoga and started studying what goes on. So by now we have thousands of studies validating the efficacy of these teachings on the body and the mind and the emotions and psychology. And that reverberates back to India as a signal that their ancient teachings have proven value to modern life. And so you now see more and more yoga studios and yoga academies and yoga research centers, as the teachings get adapted to the modern way. So you have both things going on, tremendous pride and a tremendous revival of these teachings, especially with certain modern gurus like Sri Sri Ravi Shankar and Amma and others who are not known in the West but are very well known in India, bringing the teachings into a modern world, much the way we've adapted them to our modern way of life. So you have that going on. You have the scientific evidence supporting all that. And at the same time, you have these secularists and, sort of politically minded people who have allergic reactions to anything that might resemble antiquity or religion. We have the same thing in the West, but it's more dramatic in India, because they're facing so many problems, and in this drive to modernize, these controversies become very dramatic.
I think this is such a fascinating and interesting point, because what I hear you saying is I've encountered, fairly recently as I've began this project, some kind of contemporary anti-colonialist individuals who like to kind of denigrate the Western appropriation of yoga and the Indian tradition by saying that we're kind of destroying the culture. But what I hear you saying is actually that from a certain perspective, the appropriation by a Western audience has actually supported the integrity of the teachings by sending a message sort of back to India that these teachings are worth supporting. Is that correct?
That's one thing that's going on, but I don't want to dismiss the concerns of people who are concerned about cultural appropriation. It's very real. Yeah, it's very real. It's very denigrating to Indians and Hindus that, these precious spiritual teachings, even hatha yoga, even the asanas, are being denigrated and commercialized and trivialized as, yoga, chocolate tasting yoga festivals and, naked and, naked yoga and, wine and yoga as a kind of, just a slightly calmer form of, aerobic exercise. So that is demeaning, and it is. And, as we said before, the danger is that you don't appreciate the fullness of what yoga is. But if you're Indian, if you're Hindu, it's more than just unfortunate. It feels denigrating, and it feels like these people are stealing our traditions and making a mockery of them. Yeah. So that's very real. Yeah. But at the same time, there's many Americans who venerate the Indian tradition, and their entree into yoga and meditation has created, I lead tours to India, American Veda tours, and, people love India. People love it to the point of romanticizing it. Yeah. And, so both things go on. It's not, it's not one-dimensional. And as you say, India, there are segments of Indian society that denigrate these teachings as well. So, and there's a fine line to be drawn between what, is inappropriate appropriation, so to speak, and just adapting these teachings to our way of life. Yeah. As I often say, Indians take stuff from America too. They adapted the technology of cinema and created Bollywood. Right. They didn't just remake Casablanca. They, they do their own thing with our technology. So in a sense, many people who practice yoga and take up meditation see it as a form of an imported technology that we can apply to our way of life, whether it's in medical care or, psychotherapy or physical fitness. And they don't see it as cultural appropriation. They see it as just a form of adaptation. Yeah. And it's it's not easy to distinguish those things. And it gets even more complicated. It's not as if people went to India and stole yoga and brought it back. It came here as an offering from India by, venerated gurus like Vivekananda and Yogananda. It was their gift to us, essentially. They brought it here, and they themselves adapted it to Western life and set the template for that. So it gets really complicated. Yeah, I like the distinction that you draw. I don't think I've ever heard this distinction between adaptation and appropriation, and I think that's kind of a useful conceptual distinction to kind of start to tease out, what is obviously a very complicated and controversial issue. I'm curious. Yeah. I'm curious, though. I myself haven't been to India. I hope to go this next year, actually. But I'm curious what the general reception is of white people in India, basically. Like, are Indians annoyed by the kind of spiritual seekers of the West? Yoga tourism? Yeah. It depends. Mm-hmm. Yes, some people are annoyed and offended, especially if you're walking around in short shorts and sleeveless shirts, right? Or not being appropriate in their culture, and respectful. And some just are very cynical about the, yogis coming there to go to Rishikesh and sit with gurus and all that. But others are tremendously honored by this interest in people from other cultures who come to India for spiritual illumination and self-improvement, and who come with a sense of deep respect and reverence and curiosity and so forth. I led a tour to North India last year. I'm leading one to South India next year. I don't mean last year, I mean just a few months ago. And, we were 20-some-odd people, grown-ups, and everybody there had a great love for India, great curiosity for India. Most of them were there for the first time. And we were treated with great respect and great welcoming. The Indian people, the Hindu culture has a saying, the guest is God. And, we were guests in their country, and we were treated with incredible graciousness and hospitality and so forth. So, and we were very welcome in ashrams and temples because we were sincere. And so, other people might look at a group of tourists and people heading to a temple or an ashram and think, they're just curiosity seekers. They don't appreciate us, and and of course, then there's people who just love it because we're bringing tourist money into the country.
Right.
And they're feeding their children because, we're buying, Rudraksha beads or, a shawl. And so, there's a range of reaction.
So let's we are starting to get towards the end of our conversation together. This has been so fascinating, but I wanted to end on a topic that I read in your more extended bio and I think, of course, we've been sort of talking around it or without kind of naming it, but this idea of pragmatic mysticism, what is it, and how does it differ from maybe, a traditional approach or thought idea of mysticism?
Well, I think mysticism, as if you really understand what it is, I remember reading a book about mysticism back when I first was exploring this stuff. I read all this Indian philosophy, and that led me to a book about mysticism. And I remember looking up from the book and saying to my roommate, why do they call this mysticism? It seems very practical to me. Yeah. So, mysticism has this connotation of woo-woo, mystical, mysterious, but, what it really means for people who, take these mystical traditions seriously is every what we call religious tradition, every spiritual tradition has what some scholars would call an exoteric side of it and an esoteric side of it. Exo meaning external. So the rituals, the belief system, the traditions, that's the external. But the esoteric part is the inner practices, the inner experiences. And that esoteric part was maintained in the East and is predominant in the East, which is why we took to them so much, because they were kind of lost to the West. So practices like meditation and chanting and the deeper contemplative parts of yoga, those are esoteric traditions meant to transform the person from the inside and change the nature, the state of consciousness, to connect the person with the vast mystery, you could say, of the cosmos. And that's what the essence of mysticism is. And there's a mystical component to every religious tradition. Jews had Kabbalah, Christians had the Christian mystics, St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, contemplative Christianity. Islam had Sufis. And the Hindus and Buddhists, it was more in the forefront. Yeah. And so that's what mysticism means. And, scholars have found that the mystics of all the traditions are pointing to the same or very similar truths, and the deep experiences they convey to us and teach us to have ourselves have a commonality of this union with something great and big and beautiful that we call divine. And that's the essence of yoga. So yoga is a pragmatic mysticism, because its whole nature is to give us on a practical level this deep inner transformation. And that's what the great mystical tradition should do. So in a sense, you could say pragmatic mysticism's a redundancy, but since it has that esoteric, sort of woo-woo connotation, I just sometimes use the word pragmatic mysticism to emphasize that that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in, the boots on the ground, how does it change your life?
Right.
Aspect.
Right. It sort of reminds me of the name of this project, Embodied Philosophy, which to me is a little bit of it's a redundancy, because, to me, the original meaning of philosophy, love of wisdom, has to be embodied in order to be wisdom. So, it's sort of interesting. I hear you. It's like the mysticism is often, associated with something sort of exactly woo-woo, like transcendent to the world and not realizable. But what you're really saying is that it inherently is pragmatic if we're understanding it correctly. Yeah,
that's my take on it, indeed. And this whole phenomenon that's so big in the current landscape of being spiritual but not religious, which is probably a term you'd apply to yourself, if I'm guessing correctly. I think that would be unthinkable without the advent of all these methods and teachings that came to us from the East. Yeah. It's given people a way to have a genuine, authentic, inner spiritual life without necessarily pledging allegiance to a particular religion or having to accept all the religious dogma. And in a sense, people who are spiritual but not religious are pragmatic mystics. If they have a meditation practice or yoga practice, that's what they are.
Wonderful. Wow, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Philip. This has been such an amazing conversation. I just wanted to close with giving you an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about your upcoming projects, where people can find you, and anything else you want to share.
Well, they can find me at philipgoldberg.com. That's Philip with one L. philipgoldberg.com. There's also a website for American Veda, americanveda.com, if they want to know more about that book. All my other books, like Road Signs on the Spiritual Path and others, are mentioned on my website. I also, as I said, I'm now working on a biography of Yogananda that'll be out sometime in 2018, so stay tuned.
All right.
You'll also find on my website a link to American Veda Tours. We started that company to bring people to India with an emphasis on places associated with the main gurus who came here. And so we just had our tour to the north, and then next year we'll be going to the south of India for 3 weeks. And as you said, I co-host a podcast called Spirit Matters at spiritmatterstalk.com, and you can download it from iTunes as well as a podcast. And, we interview spiritual teachers and leaders, occasionally a scholar or a scientist, on the vast array of spirituality that's now accessible to us. And we've had some really wonderful guests.
Yes.
So I would send people in that direction as well. And I also, I do talks and stuff, although I've scaled back on my travels because I have a book to write. But they can see my schedule on my website.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Philip. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you.
My pleasure indeed, Jacob. Lovely to talk to you.
All right. So I'll speak to you soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.
Bye-bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Philip Goldberg. If you'd like to hear more about Philip and his offerings, you can check out his website. It's philipgoldberg.com, and then also americanveda.com. And as usual, if you enjoy what you hear, our podcast interviews, we'd so appreciate it if you'd leave us a review on iTunes, which you can do via the iTunes app in your smartphone, iPhone, whatever you have. Thanks so much, and until next time, friends, bye-bye.